other countries would also become free. Right? So they're trying to draw a moral difference between the nationalism of oppressed countries and the nationalism of oppressive countries. At the same time, Mao was extremely critical of ethnic nationalism. In particular, wrote lots of arguments against Han chauvinism in China. So sort of defending the idea of China as a multinational state. It's kind of like the opposite of what Mill was saying before. Mill was saying that there should be a nation state and there's one nationality per state, and that sort of thing is the way to design nations, right? So Mao was at a lot of pains to sort of say that China is a multinational state and that no one ethnic group within China should achieve a dominant position. And if it does, the whole existence of China as a state will be threatened. So there are some contemporary debates in nationalism, such as what is the nature of the human person? And this is kind of like a big debate in the social sciences as a whole. Do you, as the individual, decide your identity? Or is your identity decided by your environment, by your surroundings? By things that are inherent about your existence, that you don't make choices about? Right? Does the existence of a nation give you special moral duties to your fellow citizens? And do these duties limit our freedom? If there's a war or something like that, do you have to fight to support your country? Or are you allowed to not fight for some reason? To preserve yourself, or because you don't believe in fighting, or something like that, right? And does the existence of the nation give us a reason to like people from our country more than people who are not, right? And what are the implications of this for distribution of resources between countries? Right? Is it justified that some countries are still super rich and some countries are not? So let's look briefly at communitarianism, which is the opposite of liberalism, I suppose. Liberals argue that individuals are these self-determining beings and that they're important irrespective of what country they're from, what community they're part of. The idea of universal human rights, for example, says everybody has the same rights no matter where they are, no matter where they're born, and no matter which country they're part of, right? Now, communitarianism is the opposite argument. It's the argument that the community that you're part of completely constitutes what you are. Your whole individuality is determined by the community that you're part of. You didn't choose it, it's an inherent thing. Right? So Sandel, for example, argues that a person with no knowledge of their identity can't possibly know what they want. So even the decisions that you're making have been shaped in a way by the surroundings you're born into. Right? So this argument that the community determines, or at least should determine, our individuality is what we call communitarianism. Now, one big problem with communitarianism is that if you accept this logic, there is no way to ever criticize anything that a community does or anything that a community believes. Right? Let's say you're part of a community that believes the earth is flat, and you discover that it's round. You look through a telescope or something like that, you fly into space, you notice the world is round, you come back to Earth. Try and convince the rest of the community that the world is round. And they say, no, it's not, it's flat. We've always believed that the world is flat. Our community values are determined based on the idea that the world is flat. The world is flat. You are wrong. And you're the minority. You must accept the community's values and beliefs. Right? There's no objective way to criticize that belief if you take the assumption that what most people believe is correct, that what society has always believed is correct. Right? And the next big problem is that in practice, we actually belong to many possible communities, right? We belong to a national community based on the country that we're part of or the passport that we hold. We belong to linguistic communities. Some of you belong to multiple linguistic communities based on the language that you speak, right? And if you're a religious believer or non-believer, you belong to a religious community as well, right? Let's say you're Catholic and the Pope says you should like something and your country says you should dislike that thing. Who's right? How do you decide, right? Communitarianism doesn't give you a good answer to this. You're a member of two different communities that want two different things. How do you decide what you're going to do, right? The simple argument that you should do what most of the community wants doesn't give you a moral compass at all in this situation. It doesn't give you a good way of making a decision. So if you have conflicting values, communitarianism will give you no way to get out of this conflict. So one of the implications of communitarianism is that it justifies partiality to people who are part of the same community as we're part of. You know, that we should like people from our community more than people from other communities. Right? And so Thomas Nagel, who's a political theorist, says that partiality and impartiality are sort of linked together by referring to what we call agent relative and agent neutral reasons for action. You know, to give an example of this, if a parent loves their child, this is agent relative motivation. You love the child because it's yours, that's it. The relationship you have with it equals you love it. Right? The metaphor here is, you know, you love your country because it's yours. Your relation to it is based on the fact that it's yours, and that's it. Right? So, however, if the parent accepted the idea of paying taxes to fund an education system for all children, including their own, this is what we call agent neutral motivation. In other words, you're acting in a way that is impartial between all children, even if it benefits your own child. Right? So you might accept the principle of international, like national sovereignty, for example. It benefits your country, it also benefits other countries. That's an example. Now, Nagel says that an interesting thing about partiality is that it also implies impartiality. Most parents are partial to their children. You know, I hope yours was partial to you and didn't just not love you. So hopefully your parents loved you. But the assumption in that is that other parents are going to love their children as well, more than yours. Right? So you accept that you love your child the most. That also implies accepting that other parents are going to love their child the most as well. Right? If you take that metaphor and apply it to nations. The assumption here is that, well, if I think I'm going to like my country the most, you think I also believe that you're going to love your country the most. There's kind of like this tolerance of opinion at the same time, right? It would be weird if a parent says, well, I love my child the most, and everybody else should love it the most too, right? You should forget about your child and love mine the most, right? That would be strange. So nationalists seem to be committed to this idea that it's at least permitted, or maybe even required, to be partial to people from our own country. In other words, they're committed to agent relative reason. You should like something just because it's yours, right? And some people find that a very convincing argument, but from a logical standpoint, it's not a very convincing argument, right? Like something just because it's yours, it is, you know, it's kind of tautological, you know, there's no real reason you should like it. So the problem with partiality, while it's common sense, maybe, that we're partial to people from our country, it certainly opens up a lot of questions about international relations and about justice. So this argument that says everybody's allowed to be partial to their country doesn't resolve a bunch of questions like, well, is it possible to suppress the national aspirations of others? Sometimes the interests of nations don't agree with each other, like a territorial dispute or something like that. You know, two countries equally claim one piece of territory. Only one can really solve that. You know, either one person controls it or the other person controls it, arguably. Right? So next is, are rich countries entitled to stay rich, particularly when they became rich by hurting other countries, right? So if you're a colonial or a former colonial power, like most of the richest countries of the world at some time colonized some other country, right? Are they entitled to stay rich when their wealth came from colonialism in some way, you know? Or do they have to redistribute power and resources back to the places that they stole from previously? Right? So this partiality thesis that says, well, I'm allowed to be partial to my nation, I don't have to care about other nations as much, is a justification for rich and powerful countries keeping their riches and power, you know, and not restoring balance in the world. So one possible way to avoid this partiality contradiction is to reject it entirely, and this is what we call cosmopolitanism. You know, people who say that it's not valid to like one country more than others. Every country is equal, all people are equal, right? If you meet a person like that, that's what we call a cosmopolitan, right? Cosmopolitans say that there's nothing morally significant about nations. Right? The simple fact that one person's from your nation and another person's not is morally irrelevant. It's not a reason to like one person more than another. Right? So, trying to understand cosmopolitanism, we can understand nationalism a bit better. Sort of, on the one hand, we have the argument that we should treat people from our nation better. On the other, we have the argument that it doesn't matter what nation you're from, we should treat everybody equally. Right? Those are the two sides of the argument. You have to decide which one we take. Right? So next week we'll look at multiculturalism, which is kind of an argument that different people from different nations can all coexist and it's not a problem. Right? It's kind of a cosmopolitan belief. So the last theorist we'll look at is David Miller, and his main work is on nationality. And Miller is arguing against universalist theories and says that there can't really be a single theory of justice. He's a true relativist in this way. Right? So Miller in particular defends nationalism and says that we have an ethical responsibility to prefer people from our nation, to be partial towards people from our nation more than other nations. Right? Let's look at how he constructs his argument. So Miller says that this communitarian argument that we're constituted by our community, by our social attachments, is valid, and in particular that our nation has a big impact in deciding who we are. And that as a result, this gives us reason to be partial to the nation. But he says that this doesn't give us a reason to be partial to the state. We don't have to like the government or the state, but we do have to be partial to the nation. So Miller believes that there's this shared belief of all of the members of a specific nation based on what they feel that they hold common together. And this could be like a language or a history or a tradition or anything. Right? The nation has history, and members of the nation are conscious of this history. The nation is active in character. If we look at most nations, people do stuff to demonstrate their national consciousness. They celebrate festivals together, or they celebrate big national events together, or let's say there was a day where you were particularly successful or not successful in some sort of national event, like a war or something like that. People usually celebrate that together too. Fourthly, nations are associated with a particular homeland, so a geographical space. And having a homeland is seen as a big part of Miller's concept of a nation. And lastly, nations have public cultures that are identifiable, and that we can sort of separate that national culture from other possible national cultures. So Miller further argues that national myths are important parts of what a nation is. In other words, it's not all about objective stuff. Like if we take something like a language, that's an objective characteristic that links people together. Maybe the possibility of a nationhood. But Miller says that myths are just as important. Myths are things that are not true, right? That people nonetheless believe. Right? So this is kind of a controversial claim because it says, well, people should accept things that are not necessarily rational, that are not necessarily true, because these are things that nonetheless bring people together. Shared beliefs that are not rational can bring people together just as much as shared rational beliefs can. And it's acceptable for nations to hold on to these untrue beliefs as long as it links them together as a big community. So this raises one big moral question, that can we be proud of something we didn't choose and something we didn't contribute anything to yet, right? So can we be proud of our country if we didn't choose it, right? So there's an argument first that nobody chooses their country, and so it seems that being proud of something you didn't choose is an irrational thing, right? The former German president, Heinemann, said, "I don't love my country, I love my wife." And in saying that, he's trying to make a comparison between his country, which he didn't choose, and his wife, which he did choose. You make a decision about who your romantic partner is. Right? So, take the liberal argument that free choice is important. Why is free choice important? Because it's based on a rational decision that we make. So if the nation was something we can choose, then we can feel proud of it. But if it was something we just appeared in, we have no basis for pride, right? So Miller accepts this, but says, well, there are still reasons we can like the country that we're from, right? By reflecting about ourselves and how we're created by the society that we're part of, we can feel proud of our nation and place national identity at the center of a good life. Right? So what we've seen today is that nationalism is different in the sense that it's not a universal theory, right? It's an argument for particularism. It's an argument that some countries are more important than others, and in particular, that our country is more important than any other country, whatever that is. Right? So by definition, nationalism is this claim that we should treat people differently based on the country that they're from. That might mean liking some people more than others or disliking some people more than others. Right? So we've discussed a little bit about this liberal perspective of the rights of nations to self-determination and sovereignty, but the history of colonialism and the distribution of resources makes this idea of a group of morally equal nations problematic, right? Nations are certainly not equal to each other in the current world. Resources are very unequally distributed, so that complicates this argument about nationalism a lot. We've seen today that the biggest difference within nationalism is between civic nationalism, based on political principles and values, and ethnic nationalism, based on race, ethnicity, culture, and that sort of thing. Right? But even the softest form of civic nationalism still makes the claim that the nation is special in some way. And because the nation involves a huge concentration of power, into the nation state, this idea of ethical particularism, you can be nice to people from your nation more than other nations, is concerning, right? It's been used to justify some of the worst things that human beings have done in at least the recent past, and will probably continue to do so. Nationalism is a very strong justification for why we can do horrible things to people who are not the same as us. That's probably the biggest problem with it. Okay, so I want you to reflect deeply about nationalism and what you think about it, and I hope that this lecture helps you understand about the different types of nationalism.